At the beginning of the 20th century, there is, strictly speaking, no frontier to the United States. At the beginning of the 19th century, the larger part of the country was frontier. In any portion of the country today, in the remotest villages and hamlets, on the enormous farms of the Dakotas or the vast ranches of California, one is certain to find some, if not many, of the modern appliances of civilization, such as were not dreamed of 100 years ago. Aladdin himself could not have commanded the glowing terms to write the prospectus of the closing years of the 19th century. So, too, it requires an extraordinary effort of the imagination to conceive of the condition of things in the opening years of that century. The first quarter of the century closed with the year 1825. At that date, Lincoln was nearly 17 years old. The deepest impressions of life are apt to be received very early, and it is certain that the influences which are felt previous to 17 years of age have much to do with the formation of the character. If, then, we go back to the period named, we can tell with sufficient accuracy what were the circumstances of Lincoln's early life. Though we cannot precisely tell what he had, we can confidently name many things which in this day we class as the necessities of life, which he had to do without, for the simple reason that they had not then been invented or discovered. In the first place, we must bear in mind that he lived in the woods. The West of that day was not wild in the sense of being wicked, criminal, ruffian. Morally, and possibly intellectually, the people of that region would compare with the rest of the country of that day or of this day. There was little schooling and no literary training, but the woodsman has an education of his own. The region was wild in the sense that it was almost uninhabited and untilled. The forests, extending from the mountains in the east to the prairies in the west, were almost unbroken and were the abode of wild birds and wild beasts. Bears, deer, wild cats, raccoons, wild turkeys, wild pigeons, wild ducks, and similar creatures abounded on every hand. Consider now the sparseness of the population. Kentucky has an area of 40,000 square miles. 1 year after Lincoln's birth, the total population, white and colored, was 406,511, or an average of 10 persons, say less than 2 families, to the square mile. Indiana has an area of 36,350 square miles. In 1810, its total population was 24,520, or an average of 1 person to 1 1/2 square miles. In 1820, it contained 147,173 inhabitants, or about 4 to the square mile. In 1825, the population was about 245,000, or less than 7 to the square mile. The capital city, Indianapolis, which is today of surpassing beauty, was not built nor thought of when the boy Lincoln moved into the state. Illinois, with its more than 56,000 square miles of territory, harbored in 1810 only 12,282 people. In 1820, only 55,211, or less than 1 to the square mile, while in 1825 its population had grown a trifle over 100,000, or less than 2 to the square mile. It will thus be seen that up to his youth, Lincoln dwelt only in the wildest of the wild woods, where the animals from the chipmunk to the bear were much more numerous, and probably more at home than man. There were few roads of any kind, and certainly none that could be called good. For the mud of Indiana and Illinois is very deep and very tenacious. There were good saddle horses, a sufficient number of oxen, and carts that were rude and awkward. No locomotives, no bicycles, no automobiles. The first railway in Indiana was constructed in 1847, and it was, to say the least, a very primitive affair. As to carriages, there may have been some, but a good carriage would be only a waste on those roads and in that forest. The only pen was the goose quill, and the ink was homemade. Paper was scarce, expensive, and, while of good material, poorly made. Newspapers were unknown in that virgin forest, and books were like angels' visits, few and far between.